The morning light filtered through our Chicago apartment's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the marble countertops that David insisted we needed when we moved in together 2 years ago. I stood there, coffee mug warming my hands, watching the city wake up below. 28 today. I should have felt excited, grateful, hopeful. Instead, I felt hollow. "Morning, birthday girl!" David's voice carried that familiar edge of distraction as he scrolled through his phone, not bothering to look up from the kitchen island. His designer suit was already perfectly pressed, ready for another day at the law firm where he'd been grinding toward partner for the past 3 years. "Morning," I replied, forcing brightness into my voice. "I was thinking maybe we could do something special tonight. That little Italian place on Michigan Avenue we talked about." He finally glanced up, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something guilt, maybe? But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Can't tonight, Jess. Big client dinner. You know how it is." I did know how it was. I'd been knowing how it was for months now. The canceled plans, the forgotten anniversaries, the way he looked right through me when I talked about my day teaching 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary. But this was different. This was my birthday. "David, we planned this weeks ago. You promised." "I promised to try," he cut me off, his voice taking on that lawyer tone that made me feel like a hostile witness. "But this Peters case could make my career. You understand that, right? You want me to succeed." Of course I wanted him to succeed. I'd been wanting him to succeed for so long that I'd forgotten to want things for myself. I'd been the supportive girlfriend, the understanding partner, the woman who smiled and nodded when he explained why his dreams always came first. "Right," I whispered, staring into my coffee. "Of course." He moved toward me then, and for a second I thought he might apologize, might remember that today was supposed to matter. Instead, he kissed the top of my head like I was a child being dismissed. "Make yourself something nice for dinner," he said, already heading toward the door. "You're so good at that cooking thing. Oh, and Jess, don't wait up. This could run late." The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sounds of Chicago coming alive outside. Cars honking, people rushing to catch the L train, life moving forward while I felt stuck in this beautiful apartment that never quite felt like home. My phone buzzed with birthday messages from friends, from my sister Rachel in Denver, from my mom back in small-town Wisconsin. Each notification was a reminder that other people remembered, other people cared. But the person who was supposed to care most had just walked out the door like it was any other Tuesday. I got dressed for work in the lavender dress David had bought me last Christmas, not because he'd picked it out with care, but because his assistant had excellent taste in gifts. The irony wasn't lost on me that even my birthday outfit was chosen by someone else. Lincoln Elementary buzzed with the energy that only 8-year-olds could generate. My classroom was decorated with construction paper flowers and hand-drawn birthday cards that my students had secretly prepared. Their faces lit up when I walked in, 22 little souls who thought I was the most important person in the world, at least for the 6 hours they spent in my care each day. "Happy birthday, Miss Rodriguez," they chorused, and for the first time that morning, my smile was genuine. "Did you get presents?" asked Lily, bouncing in her seat with excitement. "Did someone make you cake?" added Tommy, who had strong opinions about birthday cake being a non-negotiable requirement. I thought about David's dismissive comment about my cooking, about the empty apartment I'd return to later, about the dinner reservation I'd probably have to cancel. "Well," I said, settling into my chair as 22 pairs of expectant eyes watched me, "the day is still young." But even as I said it, even as I threw myself into teaching fractions and reading comprehension with extra enthusiasm to match my students' birthday spirit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted this morning. Something that had been cracking for months had finally broken clean through. At lunch, I sat in the teacher's lounge with my friend Maya, who taught 5th grade and had the kind of direct honesty that comes from growing up with 4 brothers in Detroit. "So, what's the birthday plan?" she asked, unwrapping her sandwich. "Fancy dinner?" Weekend getaway? Please tell me David finally planned something that doesn't revolve around his work schedule. I stared at my salad, suddenly not hungry. Client dinner. Last minute. Maya's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. On your birthday. Big case. Career-making opportunity. The words tasted bitter. Jess. Maya set down her fork and turned to face me fully. How long are you going to keep making excuses for him? It was a question I'd been avoiding for months, maybe longer. When did I stop being David's girlfriend and start being his accommodation? When did my dreams get so small that they fit entirely within the margins of his ambition? It's complicated, Maya. No, it's not. Her voice was gentle but firm. You're brilliant. You're kind. You light up every room you walk into. You deserve someone who sees that, who celebrates it, who sure as hell remembers your birthday matters. I nodded, not trusting my voice, because Maya was right and I'd known she was right for a while now. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The rest of the school day passed in a blur of birthday songs, handmade cards, and the kind of pure joy that children bring to celebrations. By the time the final bell rang, I'd made a decision. I was going to cook dinner. I was going to make David's favorite chocolate bourbon cake. The one that took 3 hours and required tempering chocolate and folding egg whites with the precision of a chemist. I was going to set the table with our good china, light candles, and wait. And if he came home and saw the effort I'd put in, maybe he'd remember why he'd once told me I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Maybe he'd remember that birthdays matter, that I matter. Or maybe I'd finally get the clarity I needed to stop pretending this was enough. The grocery store was busy with the usual after-work crowd, everyone grabbing ingredients for their own evening plans. I moved through the aisles methodically, selecting the best chocolate, the finest bourbon, organic eggs, and pure vanilla extract. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. At the flower section, I paused. David used to bring me flowers, back when we first started dating. Sunflowers, because I'd mentioned once that they reminded me of hope. I hadn't seen sunflowers in our apartment in over a year. I bought myself a bouquet. It felt like a small rebellion. Back in our kitchen, I tied my hair back and rolled up my sleeves. The familiar ritual of baking settled something in my chest. Measuring, mixing, tasting, these were skills I'd learned from my grandmother, passed down through generations of women who knew that feeding people was its own form of love. As the cake rose in the oven, filling the apartment with the rich scent of chocolate and bourbon, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe David would come home, see what I'd done, and remember that I was worth celebrating. The kitchen timer chimed just as my phone rang. David's name flashed on the screen. "Hey," I answered, trying to keep my voice light. "Jess, listen, this dinner is running really late. Don't wait up, okay? I'll probably crash at the office." The words hit me like cold water. "But David, I gotta go. Love you." The line went dead. I stood there holding my phone, listening to the timer chime insistently in the background. The cake was ready. The table was set. The candles were waiting to be lit. And I was alone on my birthday, just like I'd been alone so many other days that mattered. But as I pulled the perfect chocolate cake from the oven, golden and fragrant and beautiful, I realized something had changed. This wasn't about David anymore. This was about me, about the woman I'd been before I started shrinking myself to fit into someone else's life. I looked at the ring on my left hand, the engagement ring David had given me 6 months ago during a dinner that felt more like a business transaction than a proposal. He'd presented it like checking an item off his list. Get promoted by apartment, propose to girlfriend. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine what my life might look like without that ring, without this apartment, without constantly walking on eggshells around someone who saw my love as a convenience and my dreams as hobbies. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like taking a deep breath after being underwater too long. I had some thinking to do, and I had all night to do it. I woke up the next morning to an empty bed and a text message. Sorry about last night. Make it up to you this weekend. No, happy birthday. No acknowledgement that he'd missed the entire day. Just a promise for later that we both knew would probably be broken by another crisis, another opportunity, another reason why his time was more valuable than mine. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling of our bedroom with its expensive light fixture that David had chosen without asking my opinion. Everything in this apartment was like that, beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of my personality. I'd moved in 2 years ago and somehow never moved in at all. The smell of chocolate cake still lingered in the air, a sweet reminder of the evening I'd spent alone, eating a single slice while sitting at a table set for two. I'd blown out a candle I'd lit for myself, made a wish I wasn't ready to admit even to myself, and gone to bed feeling more lonely than I had in years. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my sister Rachel, calling from Denver where she was 3 hours behind and apparently awake early. Hey, birthday girl! Her voice was warm and familiar through the speaker. How was the big day? Please tell me David actually managed to show up for once. I closed my eyes, not wanting to say the words out loud. He had a work thing. Silence stretched across the miles between us. Rachel had never liked David, though she'd been diplomatic about it until recently. As a nurse practitioner, she had little patience for people who treated others as if they were disposable. Jess, she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. What are you doing? What do you mean? You know what I mean. You're 28 years old. You're brilliant, you're beautiful, and you're wasting away with someone who treats you like an afterthought. When's the last time you were truly happy? The question hit me harder than it should have. When was the last time I'd been happy? Really, genuinely, from the bottom of my soul, happy? It's complicated, Rach. Stop saying that. It's only complicated because you're making it complicated. Love isn't supposed to feel like work all the time. It's not supposed to make you smaller. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen with my coffee, looking at the remains of last night's dinner. The cake sat on the counter, still perfect except for the single slice I'd cut. The good china was still in the sink, waiting to be washed. The sunflowers I'd bought myself drooped slightly in their vase. I had to get ready for work, but I couldn't seem to move. Everything felt heavy. My limbs, my thoughts, the ring on my finger that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. At school, I threw myself into teaching with even more energy than usual. We were working on a unit about biography, and my students were writing about people who had inspired them. As I walked around the classroom, reading their work over their shoulders, I was struck by their choice as athletes who had overcome obstacles, scientists who had persisted despite failure, activists who had stood up for what they believed in. Miss Rodriguez, called out Aiden, a quiet kid who rarely spoke in class. Can I write about you? The question stopped me in my tracks. Me? Why would you want to write about me? Because you make learning fun, and you always listen to us, even when we have weird questions, and you make the best birthday parties. He gestured around the classroom, which was still decorated with yesterday's celebration. I felt tears prick my eyes. Here was this 8-year-old boy who saw value in me that I'd been forgetting existed. When had I stopped seeing myself through the eyes of people who actually cared about me? During my lunch break, I found myself walking through Grant Park instead of eating in the teacher's lounge. The October air was crisp, and the city buzzed with life around me. Chicago in autumn was beautiful, the kind of beauty that made you feel alive, just by breathing it in. I sat on a bench near the fountain and watched people pass by. Couples walking hand in hand, business people rushing to meetings, mothers pushing strollers, tourists taking photos. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, someone to be, some purpose that drove them forward. What was my purpose? When had I stopped having dreams that didn't revolve around someone else's approval? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. David's name flashed on the screen. Hey, I answered. Listen, about this weekend, something came up with the Peters case. I might need to work Saturday. Of course he did. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Okay, I said. You're not mad, are you? This is really important, Jess. You know I wouldn't cancel if it wasn't crucial. Did I know that? Did I really know that anymore? I know, I said, because it was easier than fighting, easier than explaining that I was tired of being understanding, tired of being flexible, tired of being the person who always accommodated everyone else's needs. Great. Love you. Gotta run. The line went dead, and I sat there holding my phone, watching a young couple share a sandwich on the bench across from me. They were laughing about something, completely absorbed in each other, and I felt a pang of something that might have been grief. Grief for the woman I used to be, the one who believed she deserved that kind of attention, that kind of joy. When I got home that afternoon, the apartment felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the light fell across the kitchen counter where my perfect cake still sat. Or maybe it was the way the silence seemed to press against my eardrums. Everything looked the same, but I was seeing it with new eyes. I walked through our living room, looking at the furniture David had chosen, the artwork his decorator had selected, the books on the shelves that were mostly his. Where was I in this space? What evidence was there that Jessica Rodriguez lived here, that she had thoughts and tastes and dreams of her own? In our bedroom, I opened the closet and stared at my clothes. When had everything become so muted, so professional, so designed to blend and rather than stand out? I remembered the bright colors I used to love, the vintage dresses I'd collected in college, the cowboy boots I'd worn until David mentioned they weren't sophisticated enough for his work events. I pulled out a dress I hadn't worn in months, a deep red one that had always made me feel powerful. I'd stopped wearing it because David had once commented that it was a bit much for dinner with his colleagues. Looking at it now, I couldn't remember why I'd cared what his colleagues thought about my dress. That evening, I cooked dinner again, not because I was trying to win David's approval, but because cooking had always been my meditation, my creative outlet, my way of showing love to others and to myself. I made simple pasta with fresh herbs from the windowsill garden I'd been neglecting. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion and decided that being alive on a Wednesday night was special enough. I was just sitting down to eat when David came home. Earlier than usual, but still after 8 o'clock. "Smells good in here," he said, loosening his tie. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion. Just dinner." He joined me at the table, and for a few minutes we ate in the kind of comfortable silence that used to feel intimate, but now just felt empty. "So," he said eventually, "I was thinking about Christmas. Maybe we could do Aspen this year? The Hartmans have a place there, and it would be good for networking." Christmas. 3 months away, and he was already planning it around work connections. "What about visiting my family?" I asked. "We haven't been to Wisconsin in over a year." "Wisconsin?" He looked at me like I'd suggested we spend Christmas on Mars. "Jess, this could be really good for my career. Your family will understand." Would they understand? Would my mother understand why her daughter never came home anymore? Would my father understand why I'd stopped calling as often? Would Rachel understand why I kept choosing a man who saw me as an accessory to his ambition? "Right," I said. "Of course they'll understand." David smiled, missing entirely the flatness in my voice. "I knew you'd get it. This is why we work so well together, Jess. You're so supportive." Supportive. The word sat heavy in my chest. When had being supportive become synonymous with being invisible? After dinner, David retreated to his home office to work on the Peters case, and I found myself back in the kitchen, staring at the chocolate cake I'd made for my birthday. It was still perfect, still beautiful, still mostly uneaten. I cut another slice and sat down at the counter, eating slowly and thinking about the conversation I'd just had. About Christmas plans that didn't include my input. About a future that seemed to involve me becoming smaller and smaller until I disappeared entirely. My engagement ring caught the light from the pendant lamp overhead, sending small rainbows across the marble surface. It really was a beautiful ring. David had excellent taste and a healthy budget. But looking at it now, I couldn't remember feeling joy when he'd slipped it on my finger. I remembered feeling relief that he'd finally proposed, that I'd finally checked that box, that we were finally moving forward. But forward toward what? A marriage where I was the supporting actress in the story of his life. A future where my dreams were hobbies and my needs were inconveniences. I finished my cake and washed the dishes, moving through the familiar routine while my mind wandered. In the distance, I could hear David on a conference call, his voice animated in a way it never was when he talked to me anymore. When had we stopped really talking? When had we stopped dreaming together? When had I stopped being a person he was excited to come home to and become just another item on his list of obligations? I dried my hands and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The city sparkled with possibility, with life, with all the dreams and ambitions of 8 million people who had decided this was where they wanted to build their futures. But what did I want to build? And more importantly, who did I want to build it with? The questions settled in my chest like seeds, and for the first time in months, I didn't push them away. Instead, I let them take root, let them grow, let them point toward a truth I'd been avoiding for too long. I wasn't happy. I hadn't been happy in a long time. And all the engagement rings and fancy apartments and promises of future weekends couldn't change that. The only question now was, what was I going to do about it? Friday arrived with an October storm that turned Chicago into a gray watercolor painting. I stood at our bedroom window, watching rain streak down the glass while David got ready for work, his morning routine as predictable as the sunrise. Shower, coffee, news on his phone, perfunctory kiss goodbye. "Don't forget," he said, adjusting his tie in the full-length mirror, "the Harrison party tomorrow night. I already RSVP'd for both of us." The Harrison party, another work function where I'd smile politely while David networked, and I made small talk with wives who had the same hollow look in their eyes that I'd been seeing in my own reflection lately. "I might not be able to make it," I heard myself say. David paused, his hand frozen on his tie. "What do you mean you might not make it?" "This is important, Jess. Harrison is the senior partner's brother-in-law. I know who he is." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I just said I might not make it." He turned to face me fully, and I saw something flicker across his features, confusion, irritation, the look he got when a witness gave an unexpected answer. "Are you feeling okay? You've been weird all week." Weird. I'd been weird. Not hurt that he'd missed my birthday. Not disappointed by years of broken promises. Not slowly suffocating under the weight of his indifference. Just weird. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. He studied me for another moment, then glanced at his watch. "We'll talk about this later. I'm late." After he left, I called in sick to work. It was the first time I'd used a sick day for anything other than actually being sick, and the small rebellion felt both terrifying and liberating. I spent the morning in my pajamas, drinking coffee, and really looking at our apartment for the first time in months. Every surface was perfect, every piece of furniture chosen for maximum impact, every detail designed to impress. But there was no warmth, no personality, no soul. It was a magazine spread, not a home. In the afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went shopping for myself. Not for work clothes or something appropriate for David's events, but for things that made me feel like Jessica Rodriguez again. I found myself in a vintage boutique in Wicker Park, surrounded by colors and textures that reminded me of who I used to be. The owner, a woman about my age with purple hair and paint-stained fingers, looked up from her book when I walked in. "Looking for anything specific?" she asked. "Myself, I think." She smiled like she understood exactly what I meant. Those are the best treasure hunts. I left with a bag full of pieces that felt like coming home. Emerald green sweater that made my eyes pop, a vintage leather jacket that David would definitely hate, earrings that caught the light and made music when I moved my head. On the way back to Lincoln Park, I stopped at a small bookstore and bought 3 novels I'd been wanting to read but never made time for. When had I stopped reading for pleasure? When had I stopped doing things just because they brought me joy? That evening, I made dinner wearing my new green sweater and the musical earrings. I'd planned something special, not for David, but for me. Coq au vin, a dish I'd learned from a French cooking class I'd taken before we moved in together. It required patience and attention, and as I stirred and tasted and adjusted, I remembered how much I loved the alchemy of cooking, the way simple ingredients could become something transcendent. David came home while I was opening the wine, and he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen like he was seeing something unexpected. "You look," he paused, searching for words. "Different." "Do I?" I poured myself a glass of Burgundy and took a sip. "How so?" "I don't know. Brighter, maybe?" He moved closer, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. "Is that a new sweater?" "Yes." I didn't elaborate, didn't explain that it was part of a larger reclamation project I'd started on myself. We sat down to dinner, and David complimented the food with more enthusiasm than he'd shown for anything I'd done in months. The wine mellowed the edges of our conversation, and for a little while it almost felt like old times. "This is nice," he said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "We should do this more often." "We used to," I said quietly. "I know. Work has been crazy, but after I make partner, things will calm down. We can travel, maybe think about buying a house, starting a family." Starting a family. The words hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross anymore. "David," I said carefully, "when you think about our future, what do you see?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, specifically, what does our life look like in 5 years?" He leaned back in his chair, already shifting into planning mode. "Well, I'll be partner by then, obviously. We'll have the house in Winnetka, maybe a place in the Hamptons for summers. 2 kids, probably, and you can stay home with them or maybe teach at a private school if you want to keep working." If I wanted to keep working. As if my career was a hobby I might outgrow. As if the 22 children who called me Miss Rodriguez and trusted me to guide them through 3rd grade were just a pleasant way to pass time until I could fulfill my real purpose as David's wife. "What about my dreams?" I asked. "Your dreams?" He looked genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean my dreams. The things I want to do with my life. My goals, my ambitions, my plans." "Jess, you can do whatever you want. I just told you that. You can keep teaching if it makes you happy." But that wasn't what I'd asked. I'd asked about my dreams, and he'd answered with his permission for me to pursue hobbies that wouldn't interfere with his vision of our future. "What if what makes me happy doesn't fit into your 5-year plan?" I asked. The question seemed to genuinely perplex him. "Like what?" "Like traveling to places he hadn't pre-approved. Like going back to school for the master's degree in educational psychology I'd been putting off. Like writing the children's book I'd been outlining in secret. Like having a partner who saw me as an equal rather than an accessory." "I don't know," I said instead. "I'm just thinking out loud." David smiled and squeezed my hand. "You're overthinking things, babe. That's what I love about you. You're so thoughtful about everything. But sometimes you just have to trust that I know what's best for us. Trust that he knew what was best for us. Not for me, not even for both of us equally, but for us as defined by his priorities, his timeline, his vision of success." After dinner, we watched a movie on the couch, David's arm around my shoulders as I curled against his side. It felt familiar and comfortable, and for a moment I let myself sink into the illusion that everything was fine, that I was just going through a phase, that love was supposed to feel like settling. But when the credits rolled and David started scrolling through his phone, checking work emails even though it was nearly 10 o'clock on a Friday night, the spell broke. "I'm going to read for a bit," I said, extracting myself from his embrace. "Okay," he murmured, already absorbed in whatever crisis couldn't wait until Monday. I curled up in bed with one of my new books, and for the first time in months, I lost myself completely in someone else's story. It was a novel about a woman who left her safe but stifling life to chase an impossible dream. And as I read, I felt something stirring in my chest that I'd almost forgotten existed, the possibility of possibility itself. David came to bed around midnight, sliding under the covers and reaching for me automatically. But when he kissed my neck, when his hands started moving with the kind of efficient passion that had replaced the hungry desire we'd once shared, I found myself pulling away. "I'm tired," I whispered, though we both knew it wasn't fatigue that had made me retreat. "Okay," he said, rolling over to his side of the bed. Within minutes, his breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman in the book I'd been reading. She'd been scared too, terrified of leaving behind everything familiar and safe. But she'd done it anyway, because she'd realized that safe wasn't the same as happy, and familiar wasn't the same as right. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of sunflowers, fields and fields of them, all turning their faces toward the light. Saturday morning brought sunshine and the kind of crisp autumn air that made Chicago feel like the most beautiful city in the world. David left early for a golf meeting with clients, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a pot of coffee. I called Rachel. "Hey," she said, her voice warm with concern. "How are you doing? You sounded strange when we talked on your birthday." "I think I need to make some changes," I heard myself say. Silence stretched across the miles between us, and I could practically hear my sister thinking. "What kind of changes?" she asked finally. "The kind that scare me." "Good," she said firmly. "You've been playing it safe for too long. What's scaring you the most?" "Starting over. Being alone. Admitting that I've wasted 3 years of my life." "Jess, listen to me. You haven't wasted anything. You've learned something incredibly valuable. You've learned what you don't want. That's not small. That's huge." After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen with my coffee and really let myself imagine at life without David, without this apartment, without the careful routine we'd built together. The thought terrified me, but underneath the fear was something else. Excitement. I spent the afternoon doing something I hadn't done in years. I wandered. I walked through Lincoln Park Zoo, through the neighborhoods I'd fallen in love with when I first moved to Chicago. I sat by the lake and watched sailboats cut through the water, watched children play on the beach, watched couples walk hand in hand with the kind of easy affection that David and I had lost somewhere along the way. By the time I got home, I'd made a decision. Not about leaving, I wasn't ready for that yet, but about honesty, about having the conversation we should have had months ago, maybe years ago. David was getting dressed for the Harrison party when I walked into our bedroom. "There you are," he said, nodding his bow tie. "You need to hurry if we're going to be on time." "I'm not going," I said. He turned to face me, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to genuine surprise. "What do you mean you're not going?" "I mean, I'm not going to the party. I don't want to go." "Jess, we talked about this. This is important." "Important to you," I said. "Not to me." "What's gotten into you lately? You've been acting strange all week, and now you're backing out of commitments we made together." "Commitments you made," I corrected. "You RSVP'd for both of us without asking if I wanted to go. Because you always go to these things. It's what we do. It's what you do. It's what I've been going along with." David sat down on the edge of the bed, looking at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "I don't understand what's happening here. Are you angry about your birthday?" "Because I explained about the client dinner. This isn't about my birthday." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true. My birthday had been a catalyst, the moment when I'd finally seen clearly what I'd been trying to ignore for months. Then what is it about? I looked at him sitting there in his expensive tuxedo, perfectly groomed and genuinely confused, and I felt a rush of something that might have been grief. He wasn't a bad person. He wasn't cruel or abusive or deliberately hurtful. He was just someone who had never learned to see beyond his own needs. Someone who had mistaken my accommodation for agreement, my flexibility for contentment. "It's about us," I said finally. "It's about the fact that I feel invisible in my own relationship." "That's ridiculous," he said, standing up and smoothing his jacket. "You're being dramatic." "Dramatic? There was that word again, the one he used whenever I expressed feelings that inconvenienced him. Maybe I am being dramatic, I said. Maybe I should be dramatic more often. He looked at his watch and sighed. Look, I don't have time for this right now. We can talk when I get home, okay? Figure out whatever's bothering you. Whatever's bothering me. As if my growing realization that we were fundamentally incompatible was just a mood that would pass, a problem to be solved and filed away. Go to your party, David, I said quietly. He hesitated at the bedroom doorway, and for a moment I thought he might stay, might sit down and really listen to what I was trying to tell him. But then his phone buzzed with a text, probably someone asking where he was, and the moment passed. We'll figure this out tomorrow, he said, and then he was gone. I stood in our bedroom, still wearing my jeans and the green sweater that made me feel like myself, listening to the sound of his car starting in the garage below. The apartment felt different with him gone, not empty, but spacious, like I could finally breathe deeply. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch with one of my new books, but I couldn't concentrate on the words. My mind kept drifting to the conversation we'd just had, to the look of genuine bewilderment on David's face when I'd tried to explain how I felt. That was the problem, wasn't it? He didn't understand because he'd never had to. I'd made it so easy for him, accommodating his schedule, his preferences, his vision of our future. I'd been so busy being the perfect girlfriend that I'd forgotten to be myself. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Maya's name flashed on the screen. Please tell me you're not at another boring lawyer party, she said without preamble. I'm not at another boring lawyer party. Good. Want some company? I've got wine and the new season of that show we started. Actually, I said, surprising myself, that sounds perfect. Maya arrived 30 minutes later with 2 bottles of wine and a bag of the good dark chocolate. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. Okay, she said, settling onto the couch. Tell me everything. So I did. I told her about my birthday, about the conversation with David, about the growing realization that I'd been living someone else's life for the past 3 years. Maya listened without judgment, occasionally making sounds of sympathy or outrage in all the right places. The question is, she said when I'd finished, what are you going to do about it? I don't know, I admitted. The thought of starting over terrifies me. What if I'm making a mistake? What if this is just a phase and I blow up my whole life for nothing? Jess, Maya said gently, what if it's not a phase? What if this is you finally waking up to who you really are and what you really want? I sipped my wine and considered her words. I keep thinking about my students, I said. They're so fearless, you know? They'll try anything, dream anything, believe anything is possible. When did I stop being like that? You didn't stop being like that, Maya said firmly. You just got convinced that being practical was more important than being happy. But it's not too late to remember. We stayed up until almost 2 in the morning, talking about dreams deferred and chances not taken, about the difference between settling and compromising, about what it meant to really love someone versus just being comfortable with them. When Maya left, I sat in the quiet apartment and let myself imagine, really imagine, what my life might look like if I had the courage to change it. The thoughts that came weren't about what I'd be losing, but about what I might find. David came home around 3, moving quietly through the apartment, probably assuming I was asleep. I heard him brush his teeth, heard the bed creak as he settled in beside me. For a long time, I lay there listening to him breathe, thinking about the man I'd fallen in love with and the strangers we'd somehow become to each other. In the morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew what I needed to do. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of autumn day that made Chicago look like a postcard. I woke up before David, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen counter watching the city come alive outside our windows. The clarity I'd felt the night before hadn't faded with sleep, if anything. It had crystallized into something solid and unshakable. David emerged around 9, looking slightly worse for wear from the previous night's party. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from me. studying my face with the careful attention he usually reserved for legal briefs. "So," he said, "about last night, I think we should talk." "I think we should too." He launched into what I recognized as his closing argument, voice measured, persuasive, designed to bring me around to his point of view. He talked about stress at work affecting both of us, about the natural ups and downs of long-term relationships, about how couples therapy might help us communicate better. I listened without interrupting, watching this man I'd shared a bed with for 2 years, who knew how I took my coffee but didn't know what I dreamed about at night, who could recite my schedule but couldn't tell you what made me truly happy. "I love you," he concluded, reaching across the table to take my hand. "We can work through this, Jess. We're good together." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt the weight of all the times I would have grabbed onto them like a lifeline, so desperate to believe that love was enough to bridge the growing distance between us. "David," I said gently, "when you say we're good together, what do you mean?" "What do you mean? What do I mean?" "We work well together. We want the same things. We fit. Do we want the same things?" "Of course we do. We both want a successful career, a nice home, a family eventually." "Those are your things," I said. "You've never asked me what I want." "I have too." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. "Okay," I said. "Ask me now. What do I want, David?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I watched him struggle, searching for answers he'd never bothered to learn. "You want," he started, then stopped. "You want to be happy. Everyone wants to be happy. What specifically makes me happy?" The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 3 years of conversations he'd only half listened to, dreams he'd dismissed as impractical, passions he'd seen as hobbies. "You like cooking," he said finally, grasping for something concrete. "I love cooking," I corrected. "I love teaching. I love reading. I love traveling, though we haven't done much of that because it doesn't align with your work schedule. I love vintage clothing and farmers markets, and staying up too late watching old movies. I love my family, even though we haven't visited them in over a year. I love writing, though I haven't told you about the children's book I've been working on because you think creative pursuits are frivolous." With each word, I watched something shift in David's expression, confusion giving way to recognition giving way to something that might have been shame. "I didn't know about the book," he said quietly. "I know you didn't. And that's the problem, David. You don't know me. Not really. You know the version of me that fits into your life, but you don't know who I actually am." We sat in silence for several minutes, the morning light shifting across the marble countertops, highlighting the space between us that felt wider than the table. "So what are you saying?" he asked finally. I looked down at the engagement ring on my finger, this beautiful symbol of a future I could no longer envision. "I'm saying I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be who you need me to be." "And you can't do that with me?" The question was quiet, vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. This was the David I'd fallen for, the one who could let his guard down, who could admit he didn't have all the answers. "I don't think so," I said honestly. "I think I've gotten so used to making myself smaller to fit into your life that I don't remember how to take up space." He stared into his coffee cup, and I could see him processing, trying to understand how he'd gotten here. "Is there someone else?" he asked. "No," I said immediately. "This isn't about someone else. This is about me." "So what happens now?" It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one that required me to leap from thinking about change to actually making it. "I think," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need to move out." The words landed between us like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples through the careful life we'd built together. "Jess, I'm not happy, David. I haven't been happy in a long time, and I don't think you have either. We've just been going through the motions." He started to argue, then stopped, and I wondered if he was finally seeing what I'd been trying to show him, that comfort wasn't the same as contentment, that routine wasn't the same as connection. "What about the apartment?" The lease isn't up until June. I'll find somewhere else to go. Maya has a spare room, and I've been saving money. What about, he gestured vaguely at the ring on my finger. I twisted it off, feeling lighter with each turn. The band left a pale mark on my finger, a ghost of the woman I'd been trying to become. I set it gently on the table between us. I think you should keep this, I said, for someone who wants the same things you want. David picked up the ring, turning it over in his hands like he'd never seen it before. I do love you, he said, and for the first time in months, I believed he meant it. I know, I said. I love you too, but love isn't always enough, is it? We spent the rest of the morning in a strange, careful politeness, dividing up 3 years of shared life with the same methodical approach David brought to legal contracts. I took my books, my clothes, the few pieces of furniture that had actually been mine. I left the good china, the expensive wine glasses, the life we'd built that had never quite fit. The chocolate cake for my birthday still sat on the counter, largely untouched. As I packed my things, I found myself coming back to it again and again, this perfect thing I'd made with so much hope and care. I'm going to finish packing and then head to Maya's, I told David as the afternoon light began to fade. He nodded from his position on the couch, looking lost in the apartment that suddenly felt too big for one person. For what it's worth, he said as I was loading the last box into my car, I'm sorry. I never meant to make you feel invisible. I know, I said. I'm sorry too, for not speaking up sooner, for letting us both settle for something that wasn't working. He helped me carry the final box down to the parking garage, and for a moment we stood awkwardly by my car, 3 years of shared history reduced to a few cardboard containers. Will you be okay? I asked. Yeah, he said, though neither of us was entirely convinced. Will you? I looked at him standing there in his perfect apartment building, still handsome, still successful, still everything that looked right on paper. Then I thought about the green sweater upstairs in one of my boxes, about the children's book I was finally going to finish, about all the dreams I'd been too afraid to chase. I think so, I said. I think I'm going to be more than okay. He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. Good, he said. You deserve to be more than okay. Maya's apartment was small and cluttered and alive in a way our pristine place had never been. She helped me carry in my boxes, and we ordered pizza and sat on her couch surrounded by the debris of my old life, planning my new one. I'm proud of you, she said as we polished off the last slices. That took real courage. It doesn't feel courageous, I admitted. It feels terrifying. Same thing, she said with a grin. Courage is just being terrified and doing it anyway. That night, I lay in Maya's spare room on an air mattress, surrounded by boxes and possibilities. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Mom says you called. Are you okay? Do you need me to come to Chicago? I typed back. I'm scared and sad and excited and free all at the same time. I think that means I'm exactly where I need to be. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, I love you. You're going to be amazing. I set my phone aside and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside Maya's windows. Somewhere out there was a life I hadn't imagined yet, adventures I hadn't planned, dreams I hadn't dared to dream. For the first time in years, I fell asleep excited about tomorrow. 6 months later, the farmers' market in Lincoln Park buzzed with Saturday morning energy, vendors calling out the day's specials while customers wandered between stalls of fresh produce and handmade goods. I stood behind my own small table, watching people flip through copies of The Garden Where Dreams Grow, the children's book I'd finally finished and self-published 3 months ago. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was mine. Every word, every illustration I'd commissioned from a local artist, every late night I'd spent editing and revising. The story of a little girl who plants a garden of impossible things, flying flowers and singing vegetables and trees that grew wishes instead of fruit, had come from somewhere deep inside me, from the part that remembered what it felt like to believe anything was possible. Miss Rodriguez. I looked up to see Lily from my class last year, pulling her mother toward my table with the kind of enthusiasm only 9-year-olds could muster. "Look, Mom, it's my teacher. And she wrote a real book." Her mother smiled as Lily carefully counted out her allowance money for a copy. "She talks about you all the time," the woman said. "Says you made her love reading." As they walked away, Lily clutching her signed copy like treasure, I felt that familiar warmth that came from knowing I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "How's business?" I turned to find Jake, the guy who ran the coffee stand next to mine. He was about my age, with kind eyes and hands that were permanently stained with coffee grounds. We'd been flirting mildly for the past month, nothing serious, just the gentle dance of two people getting to know each other. "Not bad for a Saturday," I said, gesturing to my slowly dwindling stack of books. "How about you?" Sold out of the lavender lattes. Apparently, I underestimated Chicago's commitment to fancy weekend coffee. We chatted for a few minutes about the market, about the weather, about nothing important and everything that mattered. It was easy, comfortable in a way that felt natural rather than settling. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "How's the market? Also, Mom wants to know if you're bringing anyone to Christmas this year." I glanced over at Jake, who was serving a customer with the kind of focused attention that suggested he actually enjoyed what he did for a living. Maybe I thought. Maybe not. Either way, I was going home to Wisconsin for Christmas. To my family, to the people who'd known me long before I'd forgotten who I was. Another text, this one from Maya. "Dinner tonight? I'm making that curry you love." And another from David. "Saw your book in the bookstore on Michigan Avenue. Congratulations. You should be proud." I was proud. Not just of the book, but of the life I'd built from scratch over the past 6 months. The tiny studio apartment in Wicker Park with the exposed brick walls and the kitchen window that caught the morning sun. The job at a progressive elementary school where creativity was encouraged and teachers were treated like professionals. The friends I'd made, the chances I'd taken, the dreams I was finally brave enough to chase. It wasn't perfect. Money was tighter, the apartment was smaller, and sometimes I felt lonely in ways I'd never experienced when I was with David. But it was mine. Every choice, every mistake, every small victory belonged to me. As the market wound down, I packed up my remaining books and folded my table, already thinking about next week's setup. Jake appeared as I was loading everything into my car. "There's a new art gallery opening in Logan Square next Friday," he said, his hands shoved deep in his pockets in a way that reminded me of the boys I'd had crushes on in high school. "They're supposed to have good wine and terrible cheese. Want to suffer through it together." I looked at him, really looked, and saw not a future I needed to fit myself into, but a present moment full of possibility. "I'd like that," I said. As I drove home through the Chicago streets I'd learned to navigate on my own terms, I thought about the woman who'd stood in a perfect kitchen 6 months ago, making a birthday cake for herself because no one else remembered to celebrate her. She'd been so afraid of being alone that she'd forgotten how to be herself. I wasn't afraid anymore. Lonely sometimes, uncertain often, but not afraid. I'd learned the difference between being alone and being free, between settling and choosing, between existing in someone else's story and writing my own. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was wearing the red dress David had once said was too much, my hair loose around my shoulders, my eyes bright with the kind of contentment that came from within rather than from external validation. I looked like someone who knew her own worth. I looked like someone who was finally fully awake. The light turned green, and I drove toward my small, imperfect, completely mine life, humming along to a song on the radio about second chances and new beginnings. Behind me, the sun set over the city that had taught me how to start over, painting the sky in shades of possibility.